Good day, I'm Dr. T and welcome to my office. So we are nearing the third act of spring, and this is the time when textbook requests probably should have already been in. I've got one I need to chat with the publisher because things are a little bit interesting. But mine are in, and hopefully yours are going in, which means this video really should have come out about a month ago, because this video is on textbooks. So let's start with why textbooks. These are ancient technologies. You know, ground up dead trees pushed together with ink on it. Yeah, that's old school. But, one, textbooks have evolved. Nowadays, they're not just ground up dead trees. They could be digital platforms. They could be fairly elaborate interactive software titles, which I'll get to probably towards the end. But either way, whether it be dead tree edition or interactive digital form, they're going to provide the information for your class. And these are something to work with. So as an instructor, you really can't do this completely on your own. You can kind of try, and it's kind of part of the way academia works, but you want to have at least a partner, and that partner is going to be your textbooks. It's going to organize information, give your students ability to look up information in advance, and then study something other than just their notes, because some students take great notes, a lot of students don't take great notes. Additionally, the images in there may very well be quite good. If you're a STEM instructor, you're probably used to this idea of looking at the pictures and the bold-faced words. And it's actually a legitimate way to engage with a textbook. Depends on the textbook, depends on how you engage with it, but that is a legitimate way. Study the book, look at the bold-faced words, and look at the pictures. It works great for STEM. Additionally, there might be practice problems, etc. within the book. So this does give you a particularly valuable resource as a student, and thus if it's good for the students, then it's good for you as the instructor. Now, not all students will engage with the textbook. Not all students will actually show up to class. They are adults, at least allegedly, and so if they choose not to engage with something, that's on them. But you, of course, want to be picking a good book for them to engage with. Additionally, there has been a few different ways of engaging with textbooks that are not really engaging with the book itself, but are bundled with the book. Quite often, at least for the last 20 years or so, textbooks will be bundled with a PowerPoint slide presentation for each chapter of the textbook. It's common for instructors to do PowerPoint-based lectures. I've pretty much phased away from this, but students really do like the PowerPoints. If you are using PowerPoints in your class, or even if you're not, but you still happen to have them, it's usually in the student's interest, at least the student's desire, for you to post those PowerPoints on the LMS. And you're generally only legally allowed to do this if you have made that your textbook. Because, hey, the textbook company owns the copyright to the textbook and the PowerPoints which you are publishing. And so you have to comply with their contract, which means you got to get the book in order to have the PowerPoints. So students might be like, well, I don't use the book, I just use the PowerPoints. Well, yeah, but the PowerPoints come with the book. They're not separate items. Not your call, because it's not your copyright. Now, you can make your own PowerPoints, and I strongly encourage you to do so, and start thinking about ways of teaching in a somewhat more textbook independent way. That way, you're less likely to get in trouble with copyright issues, and frankly, if you decide that that textbook company is acting kind of scummy, you can switch with no big interference to yourself. Of course, that takes a lot of work. Building a PowerPoint slide deck from scratch, well, for starters, you can't just grab any old picture off the internet or from the textbook because, copyrights! Yeah, so instead you need to go find open source images, etc., and make those PowerPoint decks from scratch. I found it can easily take 10 to 15 minutes a slide. Now, not all of the slides in your PowerPoint deck are going to be, full-fledged. You have, chapter heading slides and section heading slides, which will take you all of 30 seconds. And, you don't necessarily spend just a minute on a slide like you would at a professional talk, but still, I found it was like 3 hours to make the slides for a 50-minute class. And that was starting with at least a little bit of a starting point. So yeah, slide making can become prohibitively laborious, especially if you have multiple preps for the first time. When I first started teaching, I had 4 different preps. And this was the first time I taught any of them. So I'm preparing 4 courses from scratch. One of which I just had to take the course textbook slides and just run with them, which is a problem. They had typos all over the place. I'm dyslexic. I'm notorious for typos. This was not my fault. And even I could see the typos. I will warn you, some textbooks are not the best proofread. So you probably want a textbook with your course. But actually, let's evaluate that. What kind of textbook, if any, do you want? First, when you're thinking about which textbook you would like to use, you want to think, well, what do I want from the textbook? How do I want the students to engage with the textbook? Is it really the PowerPoint slides that I actually think they're going to engage with and get the most out of? That's fine. That's a legitimate one. Can I make those myself, though? Make them so that, I can use open source images or make the images myself? Maybe. Once you get further along in your career, but maybe to start with, probably not. You got other fish to fry. You got a lot to do your first few years. Those are hard. Or are you sitting there like, no, I want them to actually read the book. I think this has valuable information. Or potentially you're sitting there going, I don't know. Really, I just use everything off the internet or use other resources. I don't really need a textbook. Well, if the answer is you don't need a textbook, then ditch that thing. Well, if you're able to. Let's also be clear, you may not have the option to pick your textbook. Generally, if you're the only instructor teaching a course, you probably can pick whatever book you want. If there's a bunch of people who teach different sections of the same course, odds are the bookstore is going to get really whiny if you all try and have different books. They also tend to get whiny if you try and switch books like every semester or so. So you may be locked into whatever the group agrees on or whatever the elder instructor happens to have picked. So you may not have the liberty to choose your textbook, in which case this whole video is kind of academic, pun intended. Okay, so if you don't want a textbook, there's an argument just to go no textbook. This is going to lower costs for students. College has gone up in price. General household incomes have not, at least not inflation adjusted. So as such, the larger number of students do struggle to pay for college. And if you can cut 20, 30, 40 bucks off their bill, hey, that's 20, 30, 40 bucks they're not having to spend. Or in the sciences, 100, 200 bucks. Because our textbooks generally are a tad bit expensive. Now, it's generally a myth that textbooks are the dominant, cost for students. Yes, they're expensive. They always have been. But a lot of other things have gone up in price over the last, say, 20, 30 years. Textbooks, not quite so much. I actually remember my first year, 2001, fall, going to the bookstore, getting my pile of books, writing the check for, I believe it was $330 some odd. Well, I was like, hey, why don't I look what that course schedule would have cost me if I was entering college at my current school right now? Well, I plugged in the courses. Principles of Chemistry, Principles of Biology, Calc 2, English Composition 1. Ooh, this was slightly awkward. I happened to take this first year required course at my school, and we have nothing that correlates that at my current school. So we do have another completely different first year required course, so I plugged that one in as well. I got a price of $324, not including taxes. So yeah, we're pretty much within a few percent of what it cost 20 years ago, and that's not factoring in inflation at all. So textbooks, yeah, they're expensive. They've always been expensive, and in some respects, they're actually going down a little bit. One of the reasons textbooks are going down at least a little bit are instructors that don't actually use a textbook. They don't have the students buy a textbook because they know they don't really need it for the way they're teaching, and that's 20, 30, 40 bucks that the student doesn't need to spend. So, if you don't need a textbook, don't get a textbook. Or if you do feel you need a textbook, check out the open source alternatives. There are a growing number of textbooks through OpenStax or LibreText, which are completely free to use. They're completely open source. They're paid for by grants and donations. And hey, you can use them. They're almost always a digital book. You simply have the students go to a website or download a PDF, and they can access the textbook completely for free. Sometimes these are really good textbooks. Other times they're OpenStax Chemistry Edition 1 was solidly in the barely usable, almost not even worth downloading. Edition 2 was actually halfway decent and something I felt I could use for my classes. Now, if you do need to go proprietary, you've got a couple things to think about. Which proprietary book is the best? And is it noticeably more expensive? Odds are they're usually around the same price point. So that's probably not a major consideration you're going to have to do. But sometimes there are noticeable price differences for minimal quality differences. But Sometimes having students buy a $100 book, if it means that they have a noticeably better chance of success, is going to be an appreciable thing to do. It's in their best interest to buy the book. Depending on how you teach, depending on the content you're teaching. Some content, really having a book. To have the pictures, to have the bold-faced words, to have the equations spelled out in the book, things that students can go back to that maybe you lectured on, but they need to review because they didn't take the greatest notes in the world, or frankly, those images are not something they could have drawn in their notes. They really should be looking at the textbook. Sometimes these can be very valuable resources for the students, and you shouldn't be afraid to pick a slightly costly textbook if it really does bring the value to the students. Now, if you are picking those, do ask yourself, how important is the new edition? Now, I'll tell you right off the front, your bookstore will almost certainly balk at any ideas of using old editions of textbooks. They'll insist you use the newest version of the textbook. But you can always leak to your students, hey, the newest version is not necessarily required. In fact, you can leak to your students that y'all need a textbook, here's a suggestion, here's what's at the bookstore, but there are several equivalent books. Feel free to get an old edition of whatever works well. Some fields don't change all that much over time. For instance, this is a chemistry book, copyright 1971. This was my father's chemistry textbook when he took chemistry in college. I could still teach from this book. It's missing a few things, but principles of chemistry, or general chemistry, depending on what you're calling it, hasn't actually changed that much in the last half century. It is missing stuff, don't get me wrong, but I could still use it. So you might want to be thinking, hey, could the students just use an older edition? If so, I'm going to put whatever editions in the bookstore. I'm going to be open with the students the first day. Hey, you need this one. If you get a few editions back, that's perfectly fine. You can save a couple bucks. Now, there are definitely different rules with different schools. I was at one where I would have gotten in trouble had I said that. We weren't actually able to tell the students that they could get a better deal from someplace other than the bookstore. So do keep in mind that you might get in trouble for some of these things and understand your current school's culture and rules. So that is a thing. So I mentioned a little bit about the interactive options. One of the things textbook companies have been doing in order to try and make money, because the cost of textbooks hasn't actually increased that much, is trying to provide online homework systems and interactive things so that they can try and get a little bit more money out of the students, because they're corporations and that's their job, to make money. Well, when it comes to these may very well be quite helpful for you. Some of them have some nice online homework systems. You can typically grade them, which means students are probably more likely to actually do them. So as a formative assessment, there's arguments whether or not you should grade formative assessments, but quite often when it comes to homework, let's just be blunt, if you don't grade it, it ain't gonna get done. So it may as well not exist. So this way you can put a grade to it if your students are the type that maybe should be doing the formative assessments, doing the homework, learning activities, etc. And they may be the type that are not necessarily going to do it. Additionally, they're going to give quite often immediate feedback. You do an activity, you plug in the numbers and it tells you, no, you're wrong. You plug them in, no, you're wrong. Plug them in again, hey, you got them right this time. So there is some research that these do benefit students. Look at the ones that you have access to. Are they ones that are going to benefit your students? Let's just be clear. A great idea, poorly implemented, is still a bad idea. So you might find online homework systems that are just kind of defective. They sound great on paper, but when you try and use them, they're buggy, temperamental, the questions don't really work, and the students are fighting not with the content, but with just the eccentricities of the homework system. Yeah, definitely one of the major chemistry homework systems. Yeah, I definitely found that. Definitely had issues with one from one of the largest textbook companies in the world. Their homework system was absolute garbage, and at this point, I would like to not deal with a certain textbook company. With that said, when you're picking a textbook, you got a lot to think about. Is this going to help the students? Is it worth the cost that you're asking the students to endure in order to benefit from this? Are there cases where the textbook is maybe being utilized not actually for the book, but for things like the PowerPoint or the online homework system, in which case, while the book itself is the other stuff accommodate that, and it's still worth the cost to the students. So several things to think about. This will evolve as everything else does over time. But with that said, you probably should get those textbook requisitions in. Your bookstore really probably is looking to get those in real quick. Have a wonderful day.